Hi Year 6 and welcome to day 2 of our reading session. Okay, today we're going to try and finish the rest of chapter 1, and yesterday we got up to the fact where Bilbo had met Gandalf, and Gandalf had decided he was going to try and send Bilbo on an adventure, and they just left even though Bilbo for some reason had invited Gandalf to tea. The next day he had almost forgotten Gandalf. He did not remember things very well, unless he put them down on his engagement tablet, like this. Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time, there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, and then he remembered. He rushed and put the kettle on, and put out another cup and saucer, and an extra cake or two, and ran to the door. "I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf, with a blue beard tucked into his golden belt, and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed him aside, just as if he had been expected. He hung his hooded cloak on the nearest peg, and, "Dwalin, at your service," he said with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence that followed became uncomfortable, he added, "I'm just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little sniff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. "And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation?" They had not been at the table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake when there came another, even louder ring of the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and off he went to the door. "So you've got here at last!" That was what he was going to say to Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. "I see they have begun to arrive already," he said, when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it, and, "Balin, at your service," he said with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but they have begun to arrive had flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run out, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty and stuck to it, however painful. He might have to go without them. "Come on in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better, if it is all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with the white beard. "But I don't mind some cake, seed cake if you have any." "Lots," Bilbo found himself answering to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off, too, to the cellar to find a pint beer mug, and then to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes, which he'd baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, when loud came a ring at the bell again, and then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought, as he puffed along the passage. But it was not. It was 2 more dwarfs, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped as soon as the door began to open. Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "What can I do for you, my dwarfs?" he said. "Killy, at your service," said the one. "And Billy," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. "Dwalin and Balin here already, I see," said Killy. "Let us join the throng." "Throng," thought Mr. Baggins. "I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits and have a drink." He had only just had a sip in the corner, while the 4 dwarves sat round the table and talked about mines and gold and troubles with goblins and the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand and did not want to, for they sounded much too adventurous, when, ding-dong-a-ling-dang, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some four, I should say, by the sound," said Billy. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands, and wondered what had happened, and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell rang again louder than ever, and he had to run to the door. It was not four after all, it was five! Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dorry, Norry, Orry, Oin and Gloin were their names, and very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were hanging on the pegs, and off they marched with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called their ale, and some for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, so the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A big jug of coffee had just been set in the hearth, the seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting on a round of buttered scones when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry and altogether bewildered and bewothered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of another. More dwarves! 4 more! And there was Gandalf behind, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent on the beautiful door. He'd also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he'd put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat and then open the door like a pop gun. Let me introduce Biffa, Boffa, Bomber, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Biffa, Boffa, and Bomber, standing in a row. Then they hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf. In fact, no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Biffa, Boffa, and Bomber on top of him. For one thing, Bomber was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin indeed was very haughty, and said nothing about service, but poor Mr. Baggins said he was so sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray, don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now we're all here," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, the best detachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something less for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. Some red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Biffa. "And mince pies and cheese," said Boffa. "And pork pie and salad," said Bomber. "And more cakes and ale and coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarfs from the door. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him, as the hobbit stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know as much about the inside of my larders as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins. He was feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether a most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had got all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses and plates and spoons and things piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot and red in the face, and annoyed. "Confusticate and bebother these dwarves," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Fili and Kili behind them, and before he could say knife, they had whisked the trays and a couple of small tables into the parlour, and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party with the 13 dwarves all around, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling at a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least an adventure. The dwarves ate and ate and talked, and time got on, At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made a move to collect the plates and glasses. "I suppose you will all stay to supper," he said, in his politest, unpressing tones. "Of course," said Thorin, "and after, we shan't get through the business till late, and we must have some music first. Now to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin, he was far too important, and stayed talking to Gandalf, jumped to their feet and made tall piles of all the things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on the top with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, almost squeaking with fright. "Please be careful, and please don't trouble, I can manage." But the dwarfs only started to sing. "Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry floor. Leave the bones on the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crocks in a boiling bowl. Pound them up with thumping pole. And when you've finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. So that's what Bilbo Baggins hates. So carefully with the plates." And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned and put away quick as lightning, while the hobbit was turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back and found Thorin, with his feet on the fender, smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and whenever he had told one to go, it went up the chimney, or behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or round and round the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He sent a smaller smoke ring from his short clay pipe straight through each one of Thorin's. Then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green and come back to hover over the wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already, and in the dim light it made him look strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up to the wind over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." Killy and Filly rushed for their bags and brought back little fiddles. Dori, Nori and Ori brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bomba produced a drum from the hall. Biffa and Boffa went out too, and came back with clarinets that they had left among the walking sticks. To Arlen and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine in the porch." "Just bring mine in with you," said Thorin. They came back with vials as big as themselves, and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, the music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot almost everything else, and was swept away into dark lands, under strange moons, far over the water, and very far from his hobbit hole under the hill. The dark came into the room from the little window that opened in the side of the hill. The firelight flickered. It was April, and still they played on, while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against the wall. The dark filled all the room, and the fire died down, and the shadows were lost, and still they played on. And suddenly, first one and then another began to sing as they played. Deep-throated singing of the dwarves in the deep places of their ancient homes. And this is like a fragment of their song, if it can be like their song without their music. Okay, we're going to stop there, and we're going to listen to the dwarves' song tomorrow, and we're going to finish chapter 1 tomorrow. Well done for reading along with me, and well done for listening.